Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I'm Jamie Molt, and this is the Grad Connection, where my whole goal is to try to help graduate students navigate higher education and try to get away from being tripped up by policy, procedure, and process. So today's topic is going to be on authorship protocols, and this is kind of an I just kind of came to mind this morning that given that I talked about copyrights in the last video, I thought it would be good to talk about authorship protocols. And I want to talk about it in two terms. Since we're talking about research, I want to talk about it in kind of two ways. One is just kind of some thoughts that I have about authorship. And then I want to end with kind of the practical implication as it relates to like a thesis or a dissertation of the articles that are related to a dissertation or a thesis, how you go about doing that. So that's kind of where we'll end. So this I think this is pretty relevant to our research discussion, and it may be a shorter video, we'll see. But so first I want to start out with who should be an author. There are all kinds of practices out there as to how major professors, PIs, principal investigators, that kind of thing, how they determine author order. There are all kinds of shenanigans that happen, given that it's St. Patrick's Day. I guess that's an appropriate word to use, but there's all kinds of shenanigans. And so I want to talk about, most institutions have authorship policies or at least guidelines. And Purdue right now does not have one. I'm in the process of proposing one, and hopefully it'll get vetted and approved. But most of these policies define the fact that to be an author, you need to work on the project, the research projects, add something, you need to materially and intellectually contribute to the project, and you need to materially and intellectually contribute to the paper that results to be an author on that paper. If you do only one or the other of those things, it's questionable whether you should be an author. And I would say also what sometimes happens as a matter of practice is two people will work together on a project, particularly as it relates to grad students, but two people will work on a project. Graduate student either graduates or moves on to another advisor. For whatever reason, there's a departure. And even though that graduate student worked on the research project, sometimes a faculty member will publish out from underneath of the graduate student without giving the graduate student the right of first refusal. I've seen this happen between two faculty as well, where two faculty, everything's going great, and then for whatever reason, it's usually it's unreconcilable differences between the two that causes them to part, and then one publishes out from underneath the other without giving the colleague the opportunity. And I would say that's not really good form. It's certainly not collegial, and it's certainly not what I would expect of folks that work at Purdue. Most authorship policies are driven by policies that come from different organizations. Like there's the ICMJE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. That's one major group. And I would say probably the majority of authorship policies or guidelines at institutions refer to that. That's the model. Another one, and the one that I'm building Purdue's standard on, is COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. And I would say specific disciplines also have kind of guidelines or suggestions or whatever word you want to use, guidance that directs kind of how do you determine authorship. But they all kind of come back to the same idea that you need to work on the project, you need to work on the paper, and it needs to be more than just menial stuff. It needs to be, intellectual contribution. And what I mean by that is if you didn't contribute whatever it was that you contributed, the project would be significantly less. So, and I would say, if someone doesn't rise to the level of being an author, sometimes an appropriate way to give them a nod or to acknowledge their contribution is to put them in the acknowledgement section. And you always want to ask someone before you might put them in the the acknowledgement section. But I want to acknowledge, first of all, this problem, because I see in working with a lot of graduate students, this is one of the primary things, and even working with just faculty in general, this is one of the things that creates the most controversy, disagreement, difficulty between individuals is the matter of authorship and who is an author. The second thing that causes the most controversy would be the order of authors. So in some fields, it's automatically ordered alphabetically by last name or surname or family name, right? And that makes it easy. When a field has that, it just gets rid of all arguments. Where arguments come in is when you actually order authors by their contribution. And so in situations, and so the first author position, at least in Western, particularly in the United States, the first author position is the most desirable, just for the simple practical matter of when people reference it. If you have multiple authors and they use Moeller et al., Moeller and others as the abbreviation for that, as a convention, obviously it's that first author position that gets the mention. So it's that name that gets used. But I will say this is author order is kind of a second, cuss and discuss point, because what happens is sometimes commitments are made up front when the project starts, and then roles shift or change, and maybe somebody who was supposed to have the majority stake in the project or paper ends up having a minor stake in the project or paper, and then when you manipulate that or adjust that, it could be a problem, right? Now, it can also be an issue of problematic practices. There are inappropriate authorship practices that exist. And most authorship policies, guidelines, whatever you want to call them, actually acknowledge that you should not practice gift authorship. You should not practice guest authorship. You should not practice ghost authorship. And you should not practice coercive authorship. So let's talk about what these are. So first of all, gift authorship is where I would say I'll make you a co-author if you give me access to your data, to your lab, to your whatever. And the assumption here is, or the underlying thing here is that you're not going to be involved in my research. You're just giving me access to something. It's basically like quid quo pro. I give you this, you give me that kind of authorship, when there's no real involvement of one of the two parties in the authorship, but yet they're listed as an author. That's gift authorship. Guest authorship, you see less in journals and conferences. You see it more in grants, where a junior individual includes a senior individual with the hopes that it actually increases the odds of it getting accepted, getting funded, getting whatever, when the senior colleague has no intent of ever doing any work. Now, in both, when I talk about gift and guest authorship, there are scenarios where I give you access to my lab, but I'm actually helping you. So that's no longer gift authorship. That's more of a partnership where we're working together on a project and then we're going to publish together. That's acceptable. It's unacceptable when I say, okay, for me letting you use my lab, just make me a co-author. I can be the last author. That's totally fine. I mean, that's not acceptable, right? To be a co-author, I need to work on the project and I need to work on the paper, not just give you access to something. Similar with guest authorship, I gave you the scenario. But it's quite common that senior colleagues will work with junior colleagues in a mentor-mentee kind of relationship, and they work together on the project and they publish. That's not guest authorship, right? It's only when the senior person is included on there. It could be a famous person. It doesn't even have to be a senior person. It could be just someone, it could be, a person who's young in their career and very successful until you add them to your grant or whatever to get greater odds of getting accepted. If there's no intent of those individuals truly working together on the project, then it's not acceptable. Ghost authorship, you see this less in academic writing anyway. We all kind of know, when you're publishing novels or fiction or those kinds of things, people write under a pen name, they assume a name that's not their given name for whatever reason. That's one form of ghost authorship. You don't see that in academic writing, but really ghost authorship in academic writing, what we're really talking about is anyone who has written material or provided intellectual contribution who is not listed as a co-author, right? And that's what we're talking about, ghost. And then the last one is coercive authorship, where, and this oftentimes is basically a faculty member or a principal investigator being a bully, where they say, okay, you're working in the Moeller lab, and so anything that comes out of this lab, whether I'm involved with it or not, is going to have my name on it. And that's kind of like a coercive. And sometimes people are like, well, what's the difference between coercive and gift? Well, at least gift, you're getting something. In coercive, I'm just dictating to you what you're going to do. And there may or may not be benefits to it. So those are all types of inappropriate authorship practices. And sadly, I have to say that I've pretty much seen all of those in my 20-some years, 26 years, 25 years of working in academia. And so I just want to call it out right here and say it's wrong. Okay. All right, so we've talked about who should be an author. We talked about author order. We talked about inappropriate authorship practices. Let's also talk about strategy. Now, I recognize if you're a graduate student, some of this is maybe premature for you, but I don't think it's ever too early to talk about how do you, as researchers, because you're going to end up becoming a PI. I hope you end up becoming a researcher and, going after grants and all the things that you do, whether you're in academia or business and industry. But once you become the PI, you kind of have to have a strategy for publication. You can't control what projects you get. You can control what projects you go after and what you propose, and you hope they get funded. But you can't control whether it gets funded, right? But once it does get funded, you want to maximize the number of publications that you get from that project. I mean, if you're doing a dissertation and you're planning on publishing articles afterwards, I hope to God that you're getting at least 3 articles from your dissertation, right? So that you're actually getting kind of maximum mileage from that dissertation. And so the idea of maximizing publications from a project that you're working on is kind of an art and a science, right? And this is why it's important to kind of, as early as you can, serve as a reviewer, because it kind of helps you better understand the art and science of writing papers, writing grants, those kinds of things. But when we talk about maximizing the number of publications, the delicate balance is, okay, how much original finding needs to be in a publication for it to get accepted? I mean, if there's too much finding in there, then you're wasting impact. If there's too little finding in there, then it may not get accepted. So there's an art and science to that. And if you're at a residential, or even maybe not residential, but if you're at a residential university, hopefully this is something you're picking up or learning from your mentor, from your PI, from your major advisor or professor. So part 1 of the strategy is maximizing impact. Second part of strategy is having a plan, like creating a publishing plan. Now, for me, each semester, because I work in semesters, so we talk about the fall semester, August to December. We talk about the spring semester, January to May, and then you talk about summer from May to August, right? So I think in semesters. And so when I was actively working as a faculty member, publishing and doing all the kind of stuff, typically at the beginning of each semester, I would sit down and make a plan. So for example, if it were August, I'd sit down and I'd say, okay, what conferences or journals that I went to this past spring or summer do I want to turn into journal articles? So what conferences did I go to this past 9 months that I want to turn into journal articles? What conferences or journals do I want to go to in 9 months? Because those calls for participation are going to kind of come up in the fall semester. What grants are going to come up? What grant proposals, requests for proposals are going to come up in the fall? What technical writing, what kind of technical reports do I have for grants and other things that I already have? And then lastly, because I'm a faculty member, what other faculty crap do I have to do as far as writing on top of it? And I'd create a schedule. And that's not to say that schedule is written in stone, but at least gives me some targets. And it also kind of, at least for me, it helps reduce some of my anxiety, because essentially anything that I can do that gives me greater agency over the things that I do helps me control my anxiety. I'm most anxious about the things that I don't control. And so creating a plan, creating a schedule for publishing can help in that way. So part 2 of the plan of the strategy is creating a plan. Doesn't mean you have to be like, doesn't have to like life. So essentially what I would suggest is create a plan, but always in the day-to-day or the week-to-week, always ask the question, what's right now? What's the right thing for me to do right now? Because you create a plan with the view that you have at the beginning of the semester, but life has a tendency to change things, and so you may have to shift things around and ask the question, what needs to be done right now? What is right for right now? So I would encourage you to kind of take that approach. And then the third part of the strategy is having a tiered approach. And what I mean by that is kind of, hopefully you'll kind of get a sense for what are the tier A journals and conferences, what are the primo places that you might want to publish, what's tier B look like, and what's tier C look like. And most often those tiers are separated just based on something simple like acceptance rate. So like in my field, transaction on computer graphics is kind of the primo place to publish. The acceptance rate is generally about 18%. And so my tier A is basically 20% or less acceptance rate. And again, acceptance rate is simply the number of things that are accepted by that publication versus the number that are submitted. It's just a simple ratio. And so that's tier A. Tier B might be, 30 to 20. Tier C might be 35 to 30, right? But hopefully you can get a sense in your field what that is, and having a publishing strategy. Not everything that you create is going to be tier A quality. Does that mean you should ignore it if it goes straight to tier B? No. I mean, you want to mix up your portfolio some and maximize your impact to the best of your ability, because that just broadens your reach, right? So that's strategy. Maximize the number of publications, basically create a plan, and then lastly, have a tiered approach. Now, two other things I want to say. Oftentimes, one of the things you'll have to get familiar with in your field is how much text recycling is acceptable. And what I mean by text recycling is, like in my field, it's common to you write a conference paper, you come back to your institution, you revise it, and you submit it as a journal, and there's a certain amount of text reuse between the conference paper and the journal. And usually that recycled text is typically introductory material, literature review, prior work section, maybe methodology, but it's certainly not results or summary conclusion kinds of things, right? But nevertheless, you need to know what that is in your field, because some fields it's totally off limits to do any of that. In other fields like mine, you can tell, there may be up to 30% overlap that's acceptable, but you need to know what's standard practice in your field. I will acknowledge that self-plagiarism is not research misconduct, right? And actually, I think that was last week's topic. I was going to, at the beginning of this video, I think I said it was copyrights. It was copyrights, then it was research misconduct. Anyway, I lose track of weeks. But realize that self-plagiarism is not research misconduct, right? It may be seen as duplicitous, that is, getting credit twice for doing something once. May be seen as sloppy scholarship if you are too liberal with that. But it's not research misconduct. But I will say for most graduate students, and this is certainly true at my institution, you do not want to be duplicitous in the classroom, ever. And what do I mean by being duplicitous in the classroom? Let's say you have a graduate class that says maybe one of the assignments is for you to create a publishable literature review. And you're like, oh, well, this past summer I published a pretty good article that had a really good literature review. I'll just take that material I wrote for that journal and I'll turn it in as my assignment in the class. Don't do that. It'll be seen as academic dishonesty or cheating. And the severity of the penalty could be quite large. Another way in which I see students being duplicitous is they have either two classes at the same time in totally different places, or they had a class this semester and then they're going to have a class next semester, and they try to reuse material from one semester to the other, from one class to another, and oftentimes that can be seen as duplicitous as well. That is, as cheating. So I would encourage you as a graduate student not to do that. So that's kind of off-limits duplicity. Whereas, conference to journal discussion, that's a different kind of conversation. So it's context dependent. So make sure you understand the context. And I would my encouragement to graduate students is to not take any risk at all, particularly in your thesis or dissertation for sure. So last topic I want to talk about is the use of either, and it depends on what kind of dissertation you're doing, right? So there's two types of dissertation. There's what I call a traditional dissertation, where you create the dissertation and you publish afterwards. Those types of dissertations usually have a chapter structure that's like, chapter 1 is an introduction, chapter 2 is a literature review, chapter 3 is a methodology, chapter 4 is data, chapter 5 summary and conclusions, plus or minus some chapters and some appendices. But essentially you create the dissertation, it is the product of the doctoral degree, and then you publish afterwards. And most of the publishing places do not see that dissertation as a published work. Right? They see it as and most academic institutions give you a way to embargo, that is, withhold that dissertation until you've had a chance to publish those articles. Right? So that's traditional. The other type is what I would call a conventional or an article-based dissertation, which is getting more and more common in so many different fields, in lots of fields. It's been around for a long time in some fields, in others it's new. But in an article-based dissertation, chapters 2 through N are papers you've already published. And then you put a chapter on the front end that says how it's all related. You put a chapter on the back end that says where it's all going. Wrap it up and call it dissertation. And essentially, in this model, the dissertation is the byproduct from the articles that you've already published. And so they're just reverses of one another, but they're different philosophies. And so I want to acknowledge that you have to have a strategy for kind of dealing with authorship in these two things. So in the conventional model, it's relatively easy, and I kind of just described it. You create the dissertation. With the institution, you ask them to withhold publishing the dissertation, and maybe they do it in ProQuest, maybe they have an institutional repository, wherever they store their documents. Essentially, in that model, you want to ask for them to withhold the document until you've had an opportunity to publish the articles. That just makes sure that you don't have any problems getting stuff published. And again, my hope is that you would get 3 articles from that dissertation. In this model, in the article-based dissertation, you've published those articles ahead of time, and so now you're wanting to include them in the dissertation. This is where, when I was talking about the conversation about copyrights, this is where you want to make sure when you publish those articles that you retain derivative rights and public and performance display rights, because you're going to feed those articles into your dissertation. If you were doing an article-based dissertation, make sure you find out from your department, from your unit, whoever grants you your degree, find out from them to make sure that there aren't rules wrapped around how you do that, in addition to what I've already mentioned here. So, well, it looks like I was wrong on the time, as I usually am on these videos. We're going about 20 minutes, but hopefully you found this useful. We talked about who should be an author, author order, inappropriate authorship models, strategies for publishing, kind of a little bit of a conversation on text recycling, duplicity, and then lastly, kind of how all this ties into your dissertation or thesis. Hopefully you found this useful. Continuing on in this research series, I don't know how many more I've got in me in relative to research, but as long as I feel inspired to do them, I will continue to do the research series. And then once we move out of that, I'm not sure where we're going. We'll just see where it happens. So hope you have a great day. Stay healthy, stay safe. Bye-bye.